All right, deep divers, ready to dive into another fascinating topic. Today, it's all about real estate purchase agreements. These documents are crucial in the world of real estate.
They really are.
They're more than just paperwork. They're like your protection, your guide when you're buying or selling property.
Exactly. They lay the groundwork for a smooth transaction, making sure both the buyer and seller are protected.
That's the goal, right? To make sure everyone is on the same page.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing today, giving you the knowledge to navigate these waters with confidence.
We'll be diving into some real-life examples, too. Situations where things got a little tricky.
Oh yeah, we've got some stories for you, like what happened to Emily in Austin when her inspection revealed a surprise, or when Michael in Denver's seller tried to back out of the deal.
Those will come later in the Q&A, but first, the basics.
I love it. Foundations first. Oh, and before I forget, today's deep dive is sponsored by Flowers & Associates Property Rentals. They specialize in special needs housing.
Great resource.
It is. If you or someone you know needs a place that truly fits, give them a call at 901-445-8148 or visit them at flowersandassociatesbooking.com. All right, back to the foundations of real estate purchase agreements. It's a legally binding contract. It outlines all the crucial details of the sale.
We're not just talking about the address and price here.
Right, we're talking about everything. Who pays closing costs? What happens if someone changes their mind? All of those important details.
It's about eliminating surprises and making sure both parties know exactly what they're agreeing to.
No gotcha moments.
Exactly. And the great thing is, these agreements are super detailed, leaving no room for assumptions or misinterpretations.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are the core elements? What are the building blocks of a solid real estate purchase agreement?
Well, we start with the basics, information about the buyer and the seller.
Names, contact info, that kind of thing.
Yep, even those seemingly simple details are crucial. Got to make sure everything's accurate and you're dealing with the right people.
Makes sense. What's next?
Then comes the property details. Address, legal description, making sure everyone knows exactly what piece of real estate we're talking about.
No room for confusion there.
Right. And then, of course, we have the sale price, the big number everyone's focused on.
The magic number. But then there's this thing called earnest money. Sounds a bit intimidating, doesn't it?
It might sound that way, but it's actually a pretty straightforward concept. Earnest money is basically a deposit the buyer puts down.
Kind of like a good faith gesture.
Exactly. It shows the seller that the buyer is serious about the purchase.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. What about the payment terms? How does that all work?
That's all outlined in the agreement, too. It specifies how the buyer will finance the purchase. Mortgage, cash, seller financing, it's all laid out there.
Got it. So the seller knows how and when they'll get paid. Now, I'm curious about these contingencies. They sound like potential deal breakers, or at least points where things could get a little sticky.
They can be if they're not handled correctly. But think of contingencies as safety nets for both sides. They give either party the option to back out if certain conditions aren't met, like a home inspection, for example.
So this is where Emily from Austin comes in. The one whose inspection uncovered a surprise.
Exactly. Imagine finding your dream home and then discovering during the inspection that there are major issues the seller didn't mention.
Oh, that's got to be a nightmare. So what happened to Emily? Did she end up stuck with the house?
Luckily, no, because she had a home inspection contingency in her agreement.
So that allowed her to back out of the deal.
Exactly. And she got her earnest money back, too.
Wow. A real-life example of how important those contingencies can be. Like a get-out-of-jail-free card in real estate.
More like an insurance policy, I'd say, protecting both parties from unexpected problems.
I like that. So contingencies are about managing risk, making sure everyone is protected. What other kinds of contingencies should buyers be aware of?
Well, another common one is the financing contingency. That's a big one if you're getting a mortgage.
So if you can't get the loan, you're not stuck.
Exactly. Imagine going through the whole process, signing the agreement, and then the bank denies your loan. Ouch.
Yeah, that would be rough.
With a financing contingency, you can walk away without losing your earnest money.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to have in your back pocket.
Yeah.
Any other contingencies we should know about?
There's the appraisal contingency.
Appraisal.
Yeah. So let's say you and the seller agree on a price, but then the appraisal comes in lower.
Oh, so the property isn't worth as much as you thought.
Right. With an appraisal contingency, you have options. Renegotiate, walk away, or pay the difference yourself.
So it's like a safety net to make sure you're not overpaying.
Exactly. It protects you from a bad investment.
This all really highlights how important it is to have a good real estate agent, someone who can guide you through all these contingencies.
Couldn't agree more. A good agent can make all the difference. Speaking of tricky situations, remember Michael from Denver? The seller tried to back out of the deal after they both signed.
Oh, yeah. What happened there?
Well, Michael had that financing contingency in place. The seller tried to use a perceived delay in Michael's loan process as an excuse, but ultimately, the seller was in breach of contract.
So the agreement held up.
It did. It's a good reminder that these agreements are serious business.
Knowing your stuff about contingencies can really give you an advantage.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially in real estate. Okay, let's move on to another key element, disclosures.
Disclosures, what are those all about?
Think about it. You're buying a property. It's a huge investment. You need to know if there are any hidden problems.
Right. No one wants to uncover nasty surprises after they've bought the place. So what kind of things are sellers required to disclose?
It varies by state, but generally any known material defects. Things like foundation problems, roof leaks, plumbing issues, even past pest infestations, things that could affect the value or safety of the property.
So it's all about transparency, making sure the buyer has the full picture.
Exactly. It's about fairness and ethics in the transaction. Now, another part that can sometimes be confusing is the inclusion and exclusion section.
Ah, yes. What stays and what goes. That could be tricky.
It can. This section is all about avoiding misunderstandings. Imagine you fall in love with a house. It has this beautiful chandelier.
And then you find out it doesn't come with the house.
Exactly. Heartbreak. The inclusion and exclusion section spells out exactly what's included in the sale and what isn't.
Saves a lot of headaches down the line.
Absolutely. It's all about managing expectations. If you're ever unsure about something, just ask.
Good advice. So we've covered contingencies, disclosures. But what if someone doesn't hold up their end of the bargain? What happens then?
That's where the default clause comes in. This section outlines what happens if either the buyer or seller breaches the agreement.
So it's there to make sure things stay fair.
Exactly. It lays out the remedies for the non-breaching party. For instance, if the buyer defaults, the seller might get to keep the earnest money.
And what if the seller backs out?
The buyer could sue for specific performance, forcing the seller to complete the sale.
Wow, so there are real consequences for breaking the agreement.
Absolutely. The default clause is an important safeguard for both sides.
This is all so insightful. I feel like I'm finally understanding all the little details of these agreements.
It's fascinating stuff, isn't it? There's a lot more to these agreements than meets the eye. They really are the backbone of any successful real estate transaction.
Totally agree. Speaking of insightful, we've got a ton of listeners with questions about real estate purchase agreements. We've heard from Emily and Michael, but there are more real-life scenarios we'll dive into during our Q&A.
Looking forward to tackling those. We've covered a lot, but there's always more to learn. But before we get to the Q&A, let's go back to earnest money. It came up earlier, and I know it's a topic that can cause some confusion.
Yeah, earnest money. It seems simple at first, but there's more to it than meets the eye.
Definitely. We got a question from Sophia in Orlando. She wants to know about the refundability of earnest money.
That's a great question. When do you get it back? When don't you? It's all about that balance of power, right?
Right. So, Sophia, the refundability of earnest money really comes down to two things: what your specific agreement says and why the deal is falling apart.
So the agreement is like the rule book.
Exactly. It should clearly state when you can get your earnest money back and when you can't.
What if the buyer backs out for a reason covered by a contingency? Like the inspection finds a problem, or they can't get a loan.
In those cases, they should get their earnest money back. They're exercising a right that's spelled out in the agreement.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But what if they back out just because they changed their mind?
Then the seller might be able to keep the earnest money. It's kind of like compensation for their time and trouble.
So you really need to understand those contingencies before putting down any money.
Absolutely. Earnest money is a serious commitment. You need to be comfortable with the risks involved.
Good advice. And speaking of the agreement, we also got a question from Lucas in Seattle. He wants to know if the terms are set in stone or if there's room for negotiation. What do you think?
Great question, Lucas. And the answer is yes, absolutely. The terms of a real estate purchase agreement are negotiable.
Really? So it's not just take it or leave it?
Nope, not at all. Remember, this is a contract between two people. Both sides have the chance to voice their needs and concerns before anything is final. Negotiation is a normal part of the process.
That's good to know. So what kinds of things do people typically negotiate?
Well, the price is often a starting point. Buyers want to pay less. Sellers want to get more. Then there are the contingencies. Buyers might want certain ones, sellers might try to limit
It's
them.
like a back and forth dance.
You got it. It's about finding a compromise that works for everyone. A good negotiation isn't about one side winning and the other losing.
It's about finding that sweet spot where everyone feels okay with the deal.
Exactly. Now, are there other things that might be negotiable? Oh, absolutely. The closing date often comes up, and things like who pays for certain closing costs. Buyers might try to get the seller to cover some of those costs, while sellers might push for a faster closing.
So there's a lot of flexibility in these agreements.
There is, but it's important to be smart about it. Do your research, understand the market, and be willing to walk away if you can't get what you need.
Preparation is key. Now, before we jump into those listener questions, I want to emphasize one more thing. These real estate purchase agreements, they're serious legal documents.
Yeah.
Once you sign, you're committed.
You're bound by those terms, so
Mhm.
it's not something to rush into.
Definitely not.
Take your time, read everything carefully, and don't be afraid to get legal advice if you need it. Make sure you understand what you're signing.
Great advice. A real estate attorney can be a valuable resource.
Absolutely. Better safe than sorry when it comes to legal matters.
Well said. So, are you ready for those listener questions? I bet our audience is eager to hear your take on these real-life situations.
Bring them on. Let's see how this all plays out in the real world.
Okay, deep divers. Time to tackle those listener questions. Let's see how these real estate purchase agreements play out in the real world. We've already heard from Emily and Michael, but I've got a few more scenarios that I think will really bring these concepts to life. Let's start with Sophia in Orlando. She wants to know about the refundability of earnest money.
Right. When do you get it back? When don't you? It's a good question.
It is. It can be a bit confusing.
It can. As we mentioned earlier, it depends on what your specific agreement says and why the deal is falling apart. If a buyer backs out because a contingency isn't met, like a bad inspection or they can't get financing, then they should get their earnest money back.
Those contingencies are there to protect them.
Exactly. But if they back out just because they changed their mind,
No good reason, they just get cold feet.
then the seller might be able to keep that earnest money.
Makes sense. It's
Yeah.
kind of like compensation for the seller. All right, let's move on to Lucas in Seattle. He wants to know if the terms of a real estate purchase agreement are set in stone or if you can negotiate them.
Lucas, they are absolutely negotiable.
So it's not just take it or leave it. There's some wiggle room.
Definitely. It's a contract between two parties. Both sides have the chance to say what they need, what they're concerned about before they sign anything. Negotiation is a normal part of the process.
That's good to hear. So what kinds of things are usually up for negotiation?
Well, the price is a big one, of course. Then there are the contingencies. The closing date might be negotiable, and who pays for certain closing costs.
Lots to consider.
There is. It's important to do your research, know what you want, and be prepared to walk away if you can't get a deal that works for you. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with one final, really important thought. These real estate purchase agreements, they are legally binding.
They're serious business.
They are. So make sure you read everything carefully, get legal advice if you need it, and only sign when you're 100% comfortable.
Solid advice. Well, that brings our deep dive into real estate purchase agreements to a close. I hope everyone feels a bit more confident about navigating this complex world. Remember, knowledge is power, especially in real estate.
And remember, don't hesitate to reach out if you have more questions.
We've got tons of resources on our website, so check those out. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.